A ship's bell rang twice down at the cannery the morning they put her off her own dock, and the man who ordered it rang it a third time himself, slow, so the whole cove would come out and watch. Constance Pell was 40 years old that morning, and by the time the bell stopped ringing, she owned a rowboat, her father's leather satchel of lens tools, and $6 folded into a stocking, and not one plank of the wharf, the cottage, or the lobster boat she and her husband had built their whole life around on Cormorant Cove, Maine. Augustus Reeve, who owned the cannery, and by then nearly every fishing debt worth owning between Pemaquid and the Narrows, had come himself to see it done, the way a man comes to watch a knot finally give. With her $6, Constance did not buy a room at the inn or passage south to family. She rowed straight out past the breakwater to Widow's Point, where an old abandoned lighthouse stood black and shuttered against the sky, and paid the whole of it, every last cent, to a county land agent for the keeper's cottage and tower that 3 separate keepers had died trying to tend, a place so thoroughly feared that fishermen would row a mile out of their way at dusk rather than pass beneath its dark lantern room. The whole cove laughed when they heard. $6 for a lighthouse that killed its keepers, they said, from a woman too proud to admit she'd lost everything. What none of them knew, what no living soul on that coast had known for 19 years, was that something had been sealed inside that tower's stone foundation the same year the light went dark for good, something a dying man had guarded with his last hours rather than let it disappear into the sea along with him. And it was about to give Constance Pell back everything Augustus Reeve believed he had just taken. Settle in, and let us tell you exactly what she found at the bottom of that tower. Before we go any further tonight, we want to ask you for something. If you have ever stood where Constance stood, cast off by people who thought your story was already finished, stay with us to the very end, because we promise you it isn't. And tell us in the comments what corner of the world you're watching from tonight, because every one of these stories is really for you. Constance was raised on a spit of rock off the Maine coast, so small it barely earned a name on the charts, the only child of a lighthouse keeper named Obadiah Wren, a lean, silent man who tended the light at Gull Ledge for 31 years, and who taught his daughter, almost from the time she could walk the tower stairs alone, that a lighthouse was not a building at all, but a promise, and that a promise kept badly was worse than no promise at all. He taught her to read the great lens the way another father might teach a child to read scripture, patiently, reverently, showing her how each prism had to sit at its own precise angle or the whole beam would scatter uselessly out to sea instead of gathering into the single true line that guided a ship home. Any fool can light a lamp, he told her once, polishing brass with a rag worn soft from years of the same motion. It takes a keeper to make sure the light actually reaches the boat that needs it. She grew up trusting, in a way she could not have explained as a girl, that the whole world worked on that same principle, that most failures were not failures of light, but failures of alignment, and that patience applied at exactly the right point could turn a scattered, useless glow into something a drowning man could steer by. From her mother, Prudence, who mended nets and knit oilskin sweaters for half the fishing families on that stretch of coast, she learned an equally patient and equally exacting trade. Prudence could look at a torn net hauled up ragged from a storm and see, the way another woman might see a torn dress, not a ruin, but a pattern waiting to be restored. And she taught Constance to work a mending needle the way her father worked a lens, with total attention to the single knot in front of her rather than despair at the whole tangled mess. A net's only truly lost, Prudence used to say, biting a thread, when somebody decides it's not worth the mending. Between the lens and the net, Constance grew into a young woman who trusted her own patient hands over any first impression the world offered her, and she carried that trust into her marriage the way she carried her father's satchel, without the faintest notion of how completely her life would one day come to depend on it. She married Isaiah Pell at 23, a broad-shouldered lobsterman with a quiet laugh and a boat called the Steady Hope that had belonged to his father before him, and together they built a life on Cormorant Cove that suited them both. Isaiah running his traps along the ledges his own family had fished for 2 generations, Constance keeping the books and mending every net and line on the wharf, trading her mending for a share of other boats' catches, until the Pell name meant something up and down that stretch of coast. They had no children who lived past their first winter, 2 losses that bound the couple closer rather than apart, the way grief shared honestly so often does, and for 14 years they were, if not wealthy, entirely their own, running a modest, honest fishery that fed a dozen families besides their own when the season was kind. Constance believed, as settled people believe, that a life built slowly out of rope and tide and patient work could not simply be taken from her by a man with a ledger. She had 14 good years to build that belief, and one hard season to watch it dismantled plank by plank. The trouble arrived, as it so often does, wearing the face of rescue. Augustus Reeve had come up from Boston 8 years before to run his family's cannery at the head of the cove, and he had prospered in a manner that made the older fishing families uneasy without quite letting them say why, buying up boat debts and dock leases in bad seasons, with a soft, patient generosity that only revealed its true shape a year or two later, once the debt had grown teeth. He had a particular gift for arriving at a family's door in the exact week their luck turned, and Constance had watched him work that gift on 3 other households along the cove before it ever reached her own door. Watched families sign papers that felt, in the desperate moment, like rescue, and turn, within a season, into a slow strangling. The year the mackerel simply did not come, the year every boat on that coast came home light for months running, Isaiah went to Reeve for what should have been an ordinary extension on the note against the Steady Hope. The kind fishermen granted each other in hard seasons without a second thought, and came home with his jaw set in a way Constance had never seen, because Reeve had told him, gently, that the cannery's own creditors were pressing him now, and that he could no longer be so generous to fishermen whose dock leases were, as it happened, a matter of some legal uncertainty, given that the old common fishing grant along Cormorant Cove had never been properly reconfirmed at the county registry, only remembered by old men who fished it. Uncertainty. Constance would come to hate that word the way another woman might hate the smell of a particular sickness. Isaiah drowned that same hard winter, lost off the Steady Hope in a squall that came up faster than any man on that coast had ever seen one come, and Constance always believed, though she could never prove it, and eventually stopped trying, that a man with worry enough riding him misjudges a wave he would otherwise have read correctly. She had no body to bury, only an empty coffin and a stone in the Cove churchyard, and she was not yet a season into that particular grief when Reeve's own agent rode out to the wharf with a note that called the whole debt against the Steady Hope due at once, a debt Constance had never once seen in 14 years of keeping the family's books, tied, the paper claimed, to the same uncertain dock lease Reeve had mentioned to Isaiah that gentle, ruinous afternoon. She fought it the only way a widow with no standing on that coast could fight anything, which was to ask, and to be told no courteously, by a county registrar who owed his post to Reeve's quiet backing, and by a clerk who could not quite locate the older records that might have proven her right. The foreclosure, when it came, took the better part of one low tide. Reeve's men rode off with the boat itself before the water had even fully come back in, and Constance Pell was put off her own dock with a rowboat too small and too old to be worth anyone's trouble to seize, her father's satchel of lens tools, and $6 silver Isaiah had once hidden in a tin behind the stove against exactly this kind of ruin because a fisherman, he always said, ought never trust the whole of anything to a man who owned the cannery too, and a whole cove of neighbors who had watched Reeve do this same soft, patient thing to 3 other families, and had learned, the way frightened people learn, to look away quickly when it happened to somebody else. By dawn, she had decided nothing except that she would not leave Cormorant Cove a beggar, though she had no earthly notion yet how a widow with $6 managed such a thing. Her father's voice was steady in her, patient as a hand setting a prism true. Any fool can light a lamp. It takes a keeper to make the light actually reach the boat that needs it. Widow's Point stood a mile out past the breakwater, a low black finger of rock with an abandoned lighthouse tower and keeper's cottage at its tip, dark now for 19 years. Ever since the tower had been decommissioned in favor of a newer light built closer to the shipping lane, the story of why no light had ever been relit there, why the tower still stood shuttered and untouched while gulls nested in its lantern room, was one every child on that coast grew up hearing, in careful, hushed versions. 3 keepers, one after another over a span of 6 years, had died or vanished tending that light. The first swept from the rocks in a storm, the second found at the base of the tower stairs, with no mark on him and no explanation anyone could ever settle on, the third, A careful, well-liked man named Josiah Teller, simply gone one morning, the light unlit, the door barred from the inside in a way that made no earthly sense to the men who finally broke it down. After Teller, no keeper would take the posting. No family would fish within sight of the tower after dusk if they could help it, and the lighthouse service had simply built its newer light and let Widow's Point go dark and cursed in the county's memory ever since. Constance heard the story from Hester Loomis over breakfast, meant kindly, a caution to a grieving widow not to go rowing that direction, and heard a gaudier version that same afternoon from two boys skipping stones off the wharf who did not know she was listening. One of them, swearing his own grandfather, had seen the lantern room glow faint and green on certain fogged nights, though the light itself had been dark for a generation. Constance felt, the way her father used to feel a lens that had gone subtly out of true, that a story told that carefully, and that often by that many frightened people, was very often hiding something a great deal more ordinary and a great deal more dangerous than a ghost. She rode out to the point that same afternoon and found the tower exactly as described, its stone base sound, its door barred but not beyond opening, and a county notice weathered nearly illegible nailed beside it listing the light station and its half-acre of rock as surplus property available against back fees of $6, a sum so small it told her plainly that no one in 19 years had wanted it badly enough to pay even that. The land agent in town laughed when she came to claim it, told her she was buying a grave with a lamp on top, and wrote the deed anyway because $6 was $6 and a widow's money spent the same as any other. Constance thanked him without irony, the way her mother had taught her to thank the world for whatever small mercy it offered, and rode back out to the point before dusk with a bedroll and her father's tools and began, the very next morning, to do the only thing she had ever truly known how to do with a thing everyone else had given up on, which was to look at it slowly and ask what it still wanted to be. She did not go looking for treasure. She went looking for 4 dry walls a woman with almost nothing could hold in her own name, and she spent her first days simply airing out the cottage and clearing 19 years of gull nests and salt damp from the tower stairs, working from first light until her hands ached, and then, patiently, toughened, and it was on the 5th day, running her palm along the base of the tower's inner wall, the way her father had taught her to run a palm along a lens housing, feeling for the place where the stone answered wrong beneath her fingers, that she found a seam in the foundation that did not belong, mortared too fine and too deliberate, set back a half-inch from the wall around it, low near the floor, where a careless eye would take it for nothing but shadow. It took her 3 days of patient, unhurried work to open it, chiseling the mortar loose a thumb's width at a time so the stone above would not shift and come down on her. And on the evening of the 3rd day, the last block came free, and a breath of old, dry, salt and lamp oil air rolled out of a cavity no larger than a ship's berth. And Constance held her lamp into the dark and found, seated against the back wall, with his back straight, as though duty itself had held him upright to the last, the remains of a man in a keeper's coat, and cradled against his chest, wrapped twice over in oilcloth and sealed again in a tin dispatch case stamped with the mark of the Lighthouse service, the answer to 19 years of careful, frightened stories. She did not touch him that first night. Beyond a murmured word, she barely heard herself speak, sitting a long while at the top of the little stair with the lamp between her knees, letting her breathing settle the way her mother had taught her to settle it over a badly torn net before deciding where the first stitch ought to go. In the morning, she carried the dispatch case up into the daylight and worked its clasp loose with the same patient care she gave to a stubborn knot. And inside, dry as the day it was sealed, she found the true shape of what had happened to Cormorant Cove. There was, first, the original common fishing grant, drawn up by the Cove's founding families 2 generations before Constance was born, establishing beyond any lawyer's argument that the waters and dock rights along Cormorant Cove belonged not to any one company, but to every fishing family on that shore in common, held forever, administered by a keeper elected from among the families themselves. Exactly the arrangement Reeve had spent 8 patient years telling the county was riddled with uncertainty. Beneath the grant lay a keeper's log, and its final entry in hand, growing tighter and more urgent by the page, told her who the dead man was and why he had died guarding a lighthouse rather than tending it. His name had been Josiah Teller, and he had discovered, in his last season at the light, that the cannery's owner, A younger Augustus Reeve, newly arrived from Boston, had been quietly buying up the county's only recorded copy of the Common Fishing Grant's confirmation, meaning to have it declared lost or defective so that dock leases and fishing rights could be sold off parcel by parcel to whichever family could least afford to refuse his soft, patient terms. Teller had gone to the county registrar himself to warn him and had been followed back out to the point for his trouble, cornered in his own tower on a night he described in his last shaking entries as too calm for the door to have blown in on its own, and he had done the only thing a dying, faithful keeper could think to do. Hidden the true witnessed copy of the grant in the one place he was certain no hired man would think to look, sealed himself into the tower's foundation rather than let it be found and burned, and left the light unlit behind him as the only signal he had left to give, a dark tower being, to men who understood such things, its own kind of alarm. His very last line, ink gone thin as though the lamp were dying with him, read only, "Let the light stay dark until someone comes who will make it mean what it was always meant to mean." He had not lived to see whether anyone ever would. Constance Pell sat on the cold floor of a tower the whole coast called cursed, and understood that she was holding in her two hands proof that the very fishing rights Augustus Reeve had spent 8 years quietly dismantling had never been his to touch at all, and that a keeper's strange, unexplained death 19 years before had not been ghostly mischief, but the last inconvenient obstacle in a scheme that a younger Reeve had started, and an older one, the very man who had just put her off her own dock, had spent 2 decades patiently finishing. She told no one for 5 days because she understood, the way her mother understood the danger of rushing a delicate mend, that a widow with no standing waving an old keeper's log at the richest man on that coast would be dismissed before the words left her mouth. She read the grant until she could recite it whole. She read the log until she understood exactly which families Reeve had already pressed off their dock leases on the strength of a document he had quietly helped go missing. She thought, in her most honest hours, of rowing straight to Reeve himself, trading his fear of exposure for the quiet return of the steady hope alone, and letting the rest of the cove go on paying his soft, patient terms the way they always had. Reeve came out to the point himself on the 6th day, having heard, as such men always hear, that the widow Pell had been seen rowing out to Widow's Point and burning a lamp there past dark, and he came in his own launch with 2 men at the oars, and the easy, unhurried manner of someone who had never once in his life been made to wait for anything he wanted. He stood at the base of the tower and remarked, with pleasant concern, that he'd heard she'd taken quite the notion, moving into a place with such an unlucky history, and offered her, with great warmth, $50 for the light station and whatever she'd found poking about in it, sight unseen, a staggering sum to a woman who had owned $6 a week before. He watched her face for the offer to land the way it always landed, and when it did not, when she only studied him with her father's slow, reading patience and told him she'd think on it, his smile thinned, and he raised the offer twice more before the courtesy finally slipped, and he remarked that a woman alone had no real use for a haunted ruin on a bad point, and that he was, in truth, doing her a kindness, taking the headache off her hands before the next storm finished what the last 3 keepers' luck had started. Constance thanked him for his generosity and told him she would send word, and she watched his launch pull back toward the cannery already, she was certain, arranging whatever soft machinery he meant to use to take this from her the way he had taken everything else. She did not wait for it to arrive. 2 mornings later, she rode into the cove and asked Hester Loomis's husband, the minister, for the use of the meeting house, and she sent word by every child and neighbor and kindly soul who would carry it, that the widow Pell had something to say about the fishing grant, and that any family who had ever lost dock rights to Reeve's called-in debts, or feared to, ought to come here at Sunday evening. They came, filling the meeting house the way frightened, weary people fill a room when they sense, without quite knowing why, that the room might finally hold an answer. The 2 ruined households and a dozen other fishing families who had watched their own leases go the same slow, soft way over 8 winters. Reeve came too, near the back, arms folded because a man like Reeve could not bear not to be present for whatever was about to be said about him. Constance stood at the front with Josiah Teller's log and the old grant under her arm and did not raise her voice, because she had learned from a lifetime at her father's lens and her mother's mending needle that the truth, laid out plainly and without force, does not need to shout to be believed. She read them the grant first, word for word, the founders' own names among the witnesses, and watched the room's disbelief settle, row by row, into recognition as families realized they were hearing, for the first time in 19 years, the actual terms their own grandfathers had agreed to. Then she read them Josiah Teller's last entries, his own careful hand describing the scheme that had cost him his life, his final instruction that the light should stay dark until someone came to make it mean what it was always meant to mean. And she told them plainly whose soft, patient buying up of old debts had finished, 2 decades later, exactly what a younger Augustus Reeve had started, and that he was standing at the back of their own meeting house. The room did the same slow, terrible arithmetic a town does when it is finally handed the shape of a thing it has felt in its bones for years without daring to name it, and it turned, family by family, to look at Reeve. And what it found in his face was not the outrage of an innocent man, but the stillness of a man watching his fortune come apart in real time. He tried the same soft voice that had worked on so many frightened families before, calling it a grieving widow's confusion, offering his own lawyer to examine the grant's authenticity as a courtesy to the Cove, and it was Hester Loomis's husband himself who rose from the front pew and asked, in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, why a man with no fishing history on that coast would be so quick to offer his own lawyer to judge a paper he had never once been shown. There was no violence and no mob, only a meeting house full of neighbors who now knew precisely what he was, and a grant, and a dead keeper's log that 100 people had now seen with their own eyes, and that could never again be quietly made to disappear. A fisherman whose family had lost dock rights to Reeve's called-in debts offered to carry the grant to the county courthouse himself at first light, with 2 other boats escorting him so no convenient accident could befall him on the water. Reeve, who understood ruin better than any man in that room because he had built his fortune dispensing it, did the arithmetic of his own position in about the time it takes a room to finish turning, and he rose without another word and walked out into the dark, and within the season he had sold his interest in the cannery and left the coast entirely, and Cormorant Cove spoke his name afterward, the way you speak of a bad storm, as something survived rather than something missed. What Constance did with what she had found was exactly what Josiah Teller had died hoping someone would do. She did not use the grant to reclaim only the steady hope and let the rest of the cove go on paying whatever soft terms came next. She placed the restored grant into the trust of the fishing families as a body, re-recorded properly at the county grade, the county courthouse under 3 witnesses, so it could never again be quietly bought out from under them. And over the following months, the 2 ruined households got back their dock leases, and boats that had spent years fishing for another man's wages returned to their own families' names on the water. The Steady Hope herself came back into Constance's hands, not as any special favor she had angled for, but as the plain consequence of the truth finally being recorded where it had always belonged. She kept the light station for herself, the one thing on that coast that was hers by right of patience rather than restitution, and she petitioned the Lighthouse service that same year. Log and grant both laid before them as proof of why the light had truly gone dark, and asked to be named keeper of Widow's Point herself, a request so unusual for a woman alone that it took the better part of a year to grant. And when at last it was, Constance Pell climbed her father's stairs in her own tower and lit a lamp that had stood dark for 19 years. And every boat on that coast that night saw the light come back on and understood, without needing to be told, exactly whose hands had finally made it mean what it was always meant to mean. She saw to it, too, that Josiah Teller was given a proper stone in the Cove churchyard at last, naming him plainly as the keeper who died guarding the coast's common waters. And every season after, some fisherman rounding the point at dusk would dip his running lights once toward the tower, not from superstition anymore, but from something nearer to gratitude. She was 40 years old the morning. A ship's bell rang 3 times to announce her ruin, and Augustus Reeve had been so certain of his arithmetic, so certain that a widow with $6 folded into a stocking was a problem. They laughed when she rode out to a lighthouse that had killed 3 keepers and paid her last coin for it, and they were right that it looked like ruin, and wrong about every single thing they meant by it, because a thing the world calls cursed is very often only a thing someone patient enough never got the chance to explain. And Constance Pell had spent her whole life learning to true a scattered light into one that could actually guide a person home. What was sealed beneath that tower floor did lift her out of the ruin exactly as we promised tonight, and it lifted a whole cove's stolen birthright back into its own hands right alongside her, because she understood, the way her father and mother had both tried to teach her long before she ever needed to know it, that the truest patience isn't the kind that waits only for your own turn, but the kind willing to wait long enough to bring everyone else's along with it, and to keep the light burning until it does. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end of Constance's story tonight. It means more than you know that you gave this quiet half hour to a widow, a dark tower, and a keeper's last patient act of faith. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear tonight that the thing the world has already decided is worthless might be the very thing that saves them. And before you go, we would love to know the answer to the one question this whole story was really asking. When in your own life did you look twice at something everyone else had already written off and find real value hiding underneath? Leave it in the comments. We read every single one. Until next time, be patient with the tired and broken things. Be patient with yourself. And remember that a great deal of what looks like ruin is only waiting for the right pair of hands to open it and the right heart to keep the light on afterward. From all of us, thank you, good night, and until next time, stay close.